Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session, Automation at the End of Work. This online conference is organized by Goethe-Institut Indonesia, Center for Digital Society and Engaged Media. And shout out to all the committees that are making this platform possible for us. I wish you all had a wonderful day and evening wherever you are, because today is the time we are waiting for. Before we continue, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Ruth Simanjuntak, and I will be your moderator of this session. Related to this issue, I was working as a researcher for Fair Work Indonesia region to analyze the impact of gig economy practice on its workers' well-being. As the topic of today's digital discourses is automation and the end of work, we are inviting the expert who's been working along in this area, Benanav. Some of us may argue that automation is driving plenty of jobs into obsolescence, even including creative work, like maybe painting or creative illustrations. And this instance shows that automation has brought a world without work instead of creating them. And without realizing the impact, automation fosters anxiety, as employment is directly connected to our livelihood. Many question arises: does this advancement bring positive impact to our future of work, and what will shape our working life in the future? So, without further ado, I'd like to invite our speaker today, a sociologist from Syracuse University, and also the book author of Automation and the Future of Work, which has been translated into more than 5 languages copy. Let's welcome Benanav to the stage. Hi, Aaron.
Hi. Good, Ruth. Thanks so much for having me. I wish I could be with you all in person. I know it's a lot warmer there than it is here in Syracuse.
Yeah, sure.
I'm just going to, sorry?
Thank you very much for your time. And before you start, I will let you know that you'll have around 20 minutes of your time to share the presentation, and we will discuss later around 10 minutes to the audience for the Q&A.
Great. Yeah, okay. I'll just make a short presentation of the basic ideas, and then I'll be happy to take some questions. Okay. There we go. All right, so just going to talk briefly, introducing my book, Automation and the Future of Work. It's a really big topic. We hear all the time about automation and how much it's changing jobs and eliminating jobs. And the big idea that I'm talking about in my book is the idea of these automation theorists who say that we're living in an age of accelerating technological change, which is going to bring about the end of work as we know it. And you can see there some of the books that have been released in recent years that lay out this thesis. The core propositions of this group of automation theorists, who I'm going to be arguing against in my presentation and in my book, they make the following arguments. They say, first, look around you. Workers are already being replaced by ever more advanced machines, like this robot here, Pepper, the Japanese assistant robot. And then they say that this displacement that we're already seeing is a sign that we're on the verge of achieving a largely or fully automated society. Automation theorists argue that automation should entail our collective liberation from toil. It should mean that we're free from having to work, but because most people have to work in order to live, that change could turn out to be a nightmare. And then they say that the only way to prevent that nightmare from coming about, a nightmare of mass unemployment, is to implement a universal basic income and to transition to a post-scarcity society. So what, in making these claims, the automation theorists are really talking about science fiction becoming a reality. And there's a long history, almost 200 years, of thinking this way, that we have these tools and machines, and one day the tools and machines are going to be able to move themselves, and that is going to radically transform human experience. It's going to bring about a post-scarcity world where we don't have to worry anymore about how we're going to survive, what kind of jobs we're going to have. Recently on the internet, this idea of a fully automated world gave rise to this kind of beautiful dream that in the future we might live in a fully automated luxury communist society, not a drab and dark society like the USSR or the old East Germany, but instead a world where people are really free, and free especially of material concerns. There's a whole emergent literature around this, especially today, with the idea that artificial intelligence is improving so much that soon we won't need human beings to organize the economy anymore. We'll be able to have artificially intelligent digital planners that organize the economy for us. And the idea is that this will bring about a new world of pleasure, new possibilities for human beings to enjoy themselves and explore the outer limits of their lives. And in a lot of this literature, which is on the border of science fiction and futurism, there are big questions about how people will make meaning in their lives under those conditions. So if computers can do everything from paint paintings to write symphonies, and even care for our parents, how will we find meaning in our lives? These are the kinds of questions that are raised both in this science fiction literature on post-scarcity and in the contemporary discussions of what it might mean to live in an automated world. Now, when we look at evidence that this is happening, mostly what automation theorists point to are a series of changes in technology. So, for example, you see depicted here the Tesla production plant in Fremont, California, where they're building cars. And you can see how many robots they're using to build the cars. There's only one worker and in the whole picture, and they are just watching over these machines. The other thing that piece of evidence people point to is the advent of machine learning, neural networks, and artificial intelligence. And they claim that these are going to be able to soon replace human intelligence. Now, in addition to this evidence from technologies, they point to a lot of evidence from the economy. And one of the things that the automation theorists talk about is this idea of jobless recoveries, that we live in an era when with every downturn in the economy, there's a major increase in unemployment, and it takes longer and longer for people to find jobs after they lose them. And you see in this graph here, this depicted how from the early 80s to the early 90s to the early 2000s to the great financial crisis, the economy took longer and longer to recover from each recession. They also point to further evidence, not just that unemployment rates are high, but that inequality is growing. This graph shows for all of the OECD countries, which are the club of rich countries in the world, we have this growing gap between productivity growth on the one hand, that's how productive workers are with all the machines and tools they have available to them, and the growth of their real wages. As that gap opens up, it means that workers aren't getting as much of a share of the income of society, and that causes inequality to rise. Now, in addition to this technological evidence, economic evidence, the automation theorists can also just point to the rise of this billionaire Silicon Valley elite. Figures like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos seem more concerned with building spaceships and getting to Mars than they do with fixing, for example, climate change at home or improving the lives of so many people around the world who are living in poverty. And this seems to be a kind of realization in some ways of such a dystopian science fiction future. So the question that I ask in my work is, are these technological innovations and labor market trends connected? So what actually is the relationship between these new technologies that we're seeing appear and these trends like rising unemployment and underemployment on the one hand and inequality on the other? What's the real connection there? In other words, is automation responsible for the growing difficulty that workers face in finding or holding on to jobs? If the automation theorists were right, if the story I've been telling were true, we would see labor productivity growing at a rapid pace. And that's because labor productivity just measures the value produced in the economy for every hour of work. And if workers were being replaced by machines, if more and more machines were doing the work, then we'd be producing more and more value with fewer and fewer hours worked, because more of the work would be done by the machines and computers than the people. But what we see over the last 70 years is that across the most advanced economies in the world, countries like Germany, Japan, and the United States, productivity growth rates aren't rising in the recent period. They've actually been a lot lower than in the past. So countries like Germany and Japan, where we think of these countries that are like the most roboticized countries in the world, they actually are seeing much lower rates of productivity growth than they did during the immediate post-war period or even in the last quarter of the 20th century. And what I argue on that basis in my book, and the book has a much more detailed explanation of this, but I'm just giving you a brief introduction, is that it's not really the case that rates of job destruction are accelerating. The story the automation theorists tell is a story of rapid job destruction. And that's not really what's happening. It's rather that the pace of job creation is slowing down. Our economy just isn't creating enough jobs for people. And that's the main problem in the economy. And the reason for that, in my view, is not anything to do with technology, or it's not specifically or primarily to do with technology. It's rather to do with the overall slowdown in the rate of growth of the economy. This is a process that the economists call secular stagnation. And what you see in this graph here is that actually from the 1960s down to the pandemic, the overall rate of growth of all of these economies, the wealthy economies in the world, has trended downward very significantly. In the 1960s, the economy used to grow at a pace of like 5.5% per year, which is very fast for an advanced country. And today, in the last decade, it's slowed to about 1.3 or 1.4% per year. The economic engine, the growth engine of the economy, has been running down for a long time. So in the book, I spend a lot of time explaining why that's happening, what's causing the slowdown of the economic engine. I talk about how that has affected the poorer countries in the world and their efforts to develop and expand the economies of their population. But instead of talking about that detail, I'm just going to talk about some of the consequences here. So how does this way of conceptualizing the problem affect how we think about the solution? So we used to, if it's not the case that the automation story is right, and it's really the slowdown story, how does that affect how we think about solutions? Well, as I mentioned earlier in the talk, a lot of automation theorists point to this idea of universal basic income as the solution. And we see that really across the political spectrum. There are really right-wing thinkers like Charles Murray and left-wing thinkers like the people promoting this automated luxury communism who think universal basic income is the solution to the problems that we face. What I say is that if the automation theorists were right, the main issue society would be confronting would be one of distribution. We'd be living in a world where machines and computers were producing all of these things, all of these goods and services, but people wouldn't be able to earn the wages to pay for them. And the solution then would definitely be just to give people money. And in that case, people would have the money to buy all the stuff that's being produced. My argument is that the problem we face has to do with the organization of production, something running down in the growth engine of the economy. And that's what we need to think about. It's a problem of production, not a problem of distribution. And in support of that argument, I point out that for about 50 years now in the West, we've seen governments try to revive increasingly stagnant economies in ways that have been really bad for the population. Governments in the West have spent 50 years imposing austerity on populations. That means defunding public programs. Governments have been removing labor protections, so making it harder for people to feel secure in their jobs. And that, of course, has played a big role in the emergence of the gig economy, where workers have very few protections and very few rights. And we've also seen governments accumulate massive public debts in an effort to stimulate their economy. So these are all things that governments have done over the last 50 years to try to revive their economies as they've been slowing down. In the book, I also give a positive account. I don't only talk about the running down of the growth engine and the growth of the gig economy. I also try to present something more positive, because for me, those science fiction stories of post-scarcity, the dreams of a world where people don't have to worry about how they're going to survive, I think that those stories are very inspiring. And I also think that with the technologies we have today, we could really already be making progress towards that kind of post-scarcity world. And what I'm interested in is looking at the history of thinkers and ideas and even science fiction proposals that talk about how to get to that post-scarcity world without full automation. And what I find is that there's a long history of thinkers who've had that idea that with the technologies we have today, we can already advance toward a post-scarcity world. We don't need full automation in order to get there. There's really a long 500-year tradition of thinking about this. So it goes back to the very earliest days of capitalism. You have thinkers like Thomas More, who wrote the original book Utopia, and he dreamed of a world where people just wouldn't have this anxiety anymore about being able to survive. He said, "What greater wealth can there be than to be completely spared any anxiety and to live with a joyful and tranquil frame of mind, with no worries about making a living?" But More didn't think that we would achieve that through automating all work. He thought we would achieve it by figuring out what the work is that is necessary for us to live good lives, to live without having to worry, that we could organize that work that we have to do. We could all work less and we could share the work that has to be done. And that would be the way to get to a post-scarcity world. And this idea of organizing, redistributing, sharing work, and working less, and giving people freely all the things they need to live through that reorganization of work, that idea then was repeated down through the ages. So there's a very important activist and social thinker, the Black sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois. He repeated this idea in the 1920s. He said, with work for all and all at work, probably from 3 to 6 hours would suffice, and leave abundant time for leisure, exercise, study, and avocations or hobbies. So he was here imagining a world, again, where we take the work that has to be done and we share it and we all work less. And he says on that basis, who shall be artists and who shall be servants in the world to come? Or shall we all be artists and all serve? And here he's imagining exactly a world where we all contribute something to the labor necessary to keep society going, but we also all have this kind of security and free time that allows us to become like artists and do all the creative and interesting and free time activities that we want to do. And so in the book and in my future work, that's really what I've been thinking about. What would it mean to take the technologies we have today, digital technologies and also productive technologies, and turn them towards this vision of a post-scarcity society for the 21st century? I think what we would have to imagine if we did that is not to sort of dream of a world where no one has to work and where everything is done by machines and planned by computers, but rather a world where the work that has to be done is reduced and shared out among people, that those who are overworked work less, that we take the goods and services people need to survive, and in these highly productive economies, we share that with everyone and get to a world where no one has to worry any longer about their survival, using a combination of basic income maybe and basic services, and get to a world where people, they feel this real freedom that comes with not having to worry about how you're going to survive. And that would change the kind of work that we do, the kinds of desires and dreams that we have, and how we make meaning in our lives. So I'm happy to talk about those positive visions. I'm happy to talk about science fiction and its role in this. And I'm happy to talk more about automation and whether or not it's really happening and to what extent it's happening in our economy. And also about the effects the digital economy has had on working people, the rise of the gig economy, the digitalization of work and the transformation of work that's already going on in the present. So thanks again so much for having me. I hope that wasn't too long, and I'm excited to talk.
Thank you very much, Aaron. It's so we've seen a bit of your book as this presentation going, and so before we started this whole conference, the committee has asked the audience to register with some question, and one of the question is, Global South countries have been in the periphery as the spare parts producer in the assembly of global economy. In what way automation will shape this existing structure? This is one of the questions. Yeah.
That's a great question. So in the past, let's say 50 years, the global economy has really changed. It's become a much more high competition place compared to how it was in the 50s and 60s. And with all of this competition, really competition between the richest countries in the world, firms in those countries, companies in places like the United States, Japan, and Germany, in response to this competition, companies have gone to the global south, to the periphery or semi-peripheral countries to find low-wage labor and to integrate all of these suppliers into their supply chains, right? That's been a big feature of the last 50 years. And global south countries have had pretty different experiences with that. The media likes to, highlight big success stories like South Korea and now China. But a lot of other countries have really struggled to become part of those supply chains, and also their workers and governments haven't really managed to get that much money and wages from those relationships. And so I think that the transformation of work, not only the transformation of work, but also politics, is going to affect the way those supply chains are organized. So I think that's a really good question. In the West, when people talk about automation, they often talk about self-driving cars and a few other possible technological changes that they think are going to happen. But I think you're right to ask the question, what effect is this going to have on the global South? It seems like one effect could be to really make it harder for countries to advance and develop by trying to participate in manufacturing supply chains. And the reason for that is I think some of the technologies that might be coming online are technologies that make it easier to do clothing, sewing, and like shoe manufacture. And those have been things that have been big jobs in the global South and that many countries have tried to participate in. And I think some of those things might be automated. There's also a chance to change the way that electronics are assembled. And that's another big aspect of global supply chains. And we might see the new technologies making those somewhat less labor intensive. And that's the idea. Anytime something becomes less labor intensive, then it's not as necessary to produce it in those far-flung supply chains. Now, another feature of what's going on that might be even more important is just the changing geopolitical situation. The United States is engaging more and more in trade wars. They're blocking countries from producing a variety of goods, like what's just happened now with semiconductors in China. And so this geopolitical situation might take an economy that's already made it very difficult for poorer countries to develop and make it even harder for them to do so. And I think that's a very worrisome trend.
Thank you very much, Aaron, for your answer to that. And we have a live audience here today. There's like 3 questions. And may I know what time should you go teaching?
Oh, I've got a lot of time. I thought we were going to go till for another 30 minutes.
Okay, so
yeah.
So we will relate to the first question. We have a question from anonymous attendee here. What is the role of government in the future where society organizes the works among themselves? How should this be governed?
I think that's a really good question. And I think a lot of people, when they try to imagine the future, they talk about democracy and they would say we need a democratic government. And that's really important, but it's often very hard to know exactly what they mean. Like, what is the role of democracy and how much participation are people going to have? You can imagine one bad scenario where there's no participation and it's really just a technocratic or authoritarian government where people have no say in how their work is organized and what they do. But you can also imagine another kind of bad society where everyone has to participate in every decision and it becomes very chaotic and you spend more time in meetings than doing things. And so we have to figure out exactly what democracy means and what the balance is between technical expertise. Because if you live in a digital society, you need all of this technical knowledge that a lot of people don't share. What's the balance between that and democratic participation in decision making? And I think that that's a really important question and a difficult question. But I think a way to start thinking about it is to recognize that we as a society have different values and we have different things that concern us, different things that we're worried about. Maybe we're worried about climate change most of all, or we're worried about poverty and insecurity, or we're worried about, who's taking care of the older people in our society, how healthcare and elder care and childcare is organized. And the idea of having technical experts is very important because we need to know what our options are. We need to know, like, how can we organize society? How can we organize childcare? How can we organize the green economy? But those experts can never tell us which path we should choose. They can only tell us what our options are, not which one of the options we should take. And so I think that if you think of it that way, you can think about this balance in government between looking to advice about what's possible and really emphasizing the need for science and accountability of scientists, the accountability of experts, rather than a society that has a lot of nepotism and corruption and who it raises up as its experts. So we need real trustworthy people to advise us, but then we need to have popular decision-making around which of those options to choose. So I think democracy plays a really big role in this story. We really want to have a democratic government where people are choosing what to do. And I think digital technologies can actually really help organize that and make it so that people who are most affected by a decision, so if it's in healthcare, for example, like the people who work in healthcare, the people who are patients in healthcare, who are spending a lot of time in hospitals or clinics, to give them more of a say in what happens than everyone else in society. And it is possible with digital technologies and with different ways of thinking about democratic institutions to set that up in a way that where people really are the ones making the decisions, but it doesn't feel like everyone has to participate all the time in decisions that they either don't know about or aren't particularly relevant to their lives. And this is a big, interesting question. How do we use digital technologies to kind of enhance that democratic accountability and democratic participation without making a world of meetings?
Still relates to that issue of discussion. We talk about how digital technology could enhance the democratic participation of the labor, let's say. There's a question, how will labor movement be organized in an automated future?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So one really important thing to recognize is that one of the things I stress is Silicon Valley executives and boosters, they're always saying, well, there's not going to be any labor in an automated future. We're just going to get rid of all of these workers. So don't pay too much attention to their situation. They're just here temporarily. So companies in the US like Uber and Lyft, they've been saying this for a long time. They say, you're concerned about these drivers, their health, their security, but we're going to automate their jobs. So don't worry about them. And that hasn't turned out to be true. A lot of the claims about automation technologies being around the corner turn out to be myths that these Silicon Valley people are using, both to try to get money for their projects, to raise capital, and to prevent workers from organizing. And so I think the future, and actually, it's not just me saying this. If you listen to a lot of the experts on technology, they say that actually not that many jobs are going to get automated away. What's going to happen is that jobs are going to change. A lot of jobs are going to use more technology and change the way they use technology compared to the past. And that means that there's a big role for labor, right? There's a really big role for the labor movement because workers need to have a lot more of a say in what kinds of technologies actually get implemented in their workplace. With digital technologies, it's very possible for employers to change the way we do work in ways that makes it easier for employers to surveil us, to watch everything we do, every little stroke of a key, every movement of our bodies. And actually, people don't do good work under those conditions. No one likes to feel like they're constantly being watched over when they work. Actually, one of the most important things that determine how satisfied a person is with their job is how much autonomy and freedom they have to carry out that job as they want. And a lot of digital technologies make it harder for us to do that, right? So you need a very strong labor movement to make sure that that doesn't happen and to really play a role in how technologies are implemented. Now, that's really hard today because workers are really being, it's very hard for workers to organize. They're really, trapped in a lot of this low-wage economy. They don't feel like they have more bargaining power. And so that's precisely why we need to be more organized, and we need to, try to envision new ways for a labor movement to become strong in the context of a digital economy. And that's not my area of expertise, but I do think that it's really important for us to be able to have a better future.
Wow. And it's still amazing how the how movement could create another thing from how the digital technology can create something new than break something to our future. And it still relates to our last question. Is there any variation between the different way workers have interpreted their position in the face of automation? For example, between workers in the global north and the global south, or between different fields of work, such as manufacturing, service, and health, as you said earlier?
What was the question about the relationship between the workers? I missed the.
Yeah. Are there variation between the different ways workers have interpreted their position in the face of automation?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, sometimes the way workers react is surprising. So, for example, in countries like South Korea and Sweden, which are countries that have the most robots per worker in industry, workers will say, actually, these robots saved our jobs. They won't say these robots took our jobs. And the reason is that you have to look at the context. So what's happening is we live in this really hyper-competitive international economy. And in these wealthier countries, the use of robots has actually allowed workers in these highly advanced factories to keep their jobs because it's made their production more competitive. So it's not always the case, when you take into account the global economy, it's not always the case that workers, have a negative relationship to the robots and to the technologies. In countries like the United States, actually, there are fewer robots per industrial worker, and there's also many fewer industrial jobs. So again, these situations are a bit more paradoxical than the automation theory would lead you to believe. Now, I think technology is transforming work everywhere, and it's affecting all of these different fields. And what I find so sad is that a lot of the ways these technologies are being implemented in the global north and the global south, like I said, is more to use digital technologies to manage workers and also to watch over them and surveil every movement they make. And I think the reaction to that has been pretty negative. But I also think there are places you can look at where technologies don't quite have that effect. There's one example I like to talk about is in the Netherlands, in the Dutch economy. There are these home healthcare aides who work at home with patients who can't take care of themselves fully. And these healthcare aides are actually self-organized. They run their own company, and they do most of the healthcare work at home in the Netherlands. And they use digital technologies to connect with each other. So instead of being managed by, algorithms, they use something like a Facebook, like an intranet, to connect to one another and ask each other questions. Hey, I saw this person yesterday who had this particular disease. Has anyone worked with someone with that before? So there would be ways to use technologies to make workers more powerful and to connect workers to each other more. All of those potentials are there. And what we see developed in these different places is that the technologies are being used in the interests of the employers rather than improving the conditions of work for the workers. And I think that's something, again, playing out across the world that we really need to pay attention to.
To responding to your answer, there is one anonymous attendee here say that I think many people already lost their job right now because some jobs are now less labor intensive due to technology. But it is difficult for the workers being displaced to work other jobs because lack of skills. What do you think this transition should be?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And a lot of people have lost their jobs. And it's really important to know that one of the things I stress in my work is that in every period in the history of capitalism, workers lose their jobs because of technological change. And what's really important to know is that that process of job loss due to technological change is actually slower today than it was in the past. If you think about 60 or 70 years ago in a country like the United States and think about what kind of jobs people used to do, I mean, so many of those jobs, a lot more people in the first half of the 20th century were farmers, right? Or they worked, rather simple jobs on an assembly line. And a lot of those jobs have disappeared. And that actually happened at a faster pace in the past than it's happening today. Today, people change their jobs and occupations much less frequently than they did before in the United States. I know that's hard to believe, but all the statistics agree about that. Now, the question of whether what are people going to do and the new skills they need? First of all, it's really true that people need more training and educational opportunities. And that's a big role that governments could play. They could devote more resources to educating and retraining people. What we see is that there's very few countries in the world, countries like Denmark and Sweden, that actually devote substantial public resources to that work of retraining. Most countries say they're going to do it, but then they don't actually create the infrastructure allowing people to retrain themselves. And I think any future would be one, any positive future would be one that makes it easier for people to switch jobs. And when people have that kind of enthusiasm and excitement about learning something new, that they provide opportunities for them to do that. But it's really important to know that there's a big story people tell where it's just workers' failure to train themselves. It's like they blame workers for not, doing that work of retraining themselves. And I think we should be very skeptical of that discourse for a few reasons. One is that look at a country like the United States. Like that's a country, one of the most advanced countries. 40% of people who graduate from college get jobs that don't require a college degree. So 40% of the people already getting college degrees are getting jobs that don't require them. So that should tell you that it's not just a story about a lack of education, maybe skills, but it's not a story just about lack of education. And actually, when you look at what jobs are going to grow in the future, a lot of those jobs don't require college education. It's jobs like home healthcare aides, delivery service workers, and so on. And so what we need is just better working conditions and higher wages for people, and for people to share work and for everyone to work less, rather than just looking to education and retraining as the solution to the problem.
Personally, because I work around the fair work in Indonesia, so we mainly emphasize on the livelihood of its workers in the gig economy. It's still too far to apply those in global south because of the poor regulation. The reason why the investment coming is because we pay very low wages to its worker. Yeah, that's part of the problem.
Yeah.
Okay. And coming to the next question, so you have readers. The anonymous attendee here say that he or she has read your book, and he or she asked about what is the best introductory and illuminating reading you recommend if we want to get into this topic, aside from your book, which I'll buy.
Yeah. That's a great question. There's so much that you can read about it. Maybe I'll recommend a few other books that I think are interesting. There's a book by, and a lot of these are from the same publisher. So, but I say that in advance because I don't, maybe it's my interest somehow to promote my fellow workers who've written books in this field. But there's a book by Gavin Mueller called Breaking Things at Work. That's a reinterpretation of the Luddite movement. I think that's very interesting. There's a podcast online called Tech Won't Save Us by Paris Marx. And he also wrote a book about transportation and gig workers and Uber workers, and about the future of cars and cities. So Paris Marx, Tech Won't Save Us. And there's another podcast called This Machine Kills that I highly recommend. And if you look at the kind of authors who go on those shows about technology, This Machine Kills and Tech Won't Save Us, you'll have a wealth of resources to connect to other people thinking in this area, because I think it's a very interesting area to explore. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Aaron, for the recommendation. And we have another 3 questions live here. There's Sifa Nurjana. She's asking, is it possible for machines to do creative work in the future? For example, composing music, making paintings, or writing novels, since these jobs require imagination?
That's a great question. And, a lot of the big advances we've seen just in the last few months online have really been those kind of advances. They've been like these computers that can type words and paragraphs and make really weird kind of surreal pictures. And it's very interesting and exciting times, I think, in those kind of technologies. I think, again, though, we should be skeptical of the claims about what these technologies can do. The idea that they're about to replace artists or writers or researchers isn't really true. What they might do is they might change the way that work is done to some extent. They might make it possible to use computers to think creatively and to, imagine different kinds of possibilities. But the computers just really aren't intelligent enough to do that work. So I think that there's still going to be a big role for creative people in the future. But I think that in the future, as in the present, it's going to be very hard for most people to make money doing those kinds of jobs. In that business, for example, in the United States, there's so many people who want to be writers that the publishing industry is able to pay most people, very little money to do that. And there's a few superstars who are artists, for example, or writers who make a lot of money, but most people are just scraping by in the freelance economy. And again, I think that's a real problem. I think we want to live in a world where more people can do creative work and have time and have participation in that kind of creative stuff. That's a dream that a lot of people have, but we're not going to get there unless we really change how the economy is organized. And I think that question of the organization of the creative economy is something really interesting for thinking about a positive future for us. But yeah, so I'm sorry to say that I think on the one hand, I don't think those technologies are going to get rid of the jobs, actually. We should be more skeptical of those claims. But on the other hand, we have to face the reality that a lot of the creative economy is very insecure and precarious, even without those computers.
Yeah, I agree. And from what I see in the ads that we have in this digital platform, let's say from the YouTube, maybe if you watch YouTube, sometimes you will have the ads from rephrasing your work, as if you are a writer or a researcher. Sometimes they will give you ads for that. Yeah, and I think like it creates something. It relates to your job, and yeah. So there's other question related to, I think it's interesting that the anonymous attendees asked, since you mentioned that we actually already have the technology, do you believe we would ever achieve fully automated luxury communism? And if yes, how near or far into the future would you predict that we be able to realistically achieve it?
So let me clarify. I think we don't have that technology right now. We do not have that technology. We have technologies that could radically change how we work, how we organize society. We already have those technologies, but we don't have technologies that could get us to a fully automated luxury future. I believe that, in order to get to a world where people work less, we have the technologies now to achieve that. And I also think that our only hope for achieving, a really positive future, even a world where people don't have to do any kind of work they don't want to, is to begin to transform the world right now in a way that makes a much bigger role for average everyday people, working people, to have a say in how their work is organized. We have to really change how research is done, how technologies are implemented to make the world better for people, just in order to be able to get to that science fiction future. And you really see that, I think, as the last question left also says, we're facing a very dangerous situation with climate change. And unless we really change how our economy is organized so that we can respond to those challenges and make the economy and the digital economy much more sustainable, unless we do that, I don't think we're ever going to get to that kind of beautiful and better future. So we definitely need to change things now, but long before we achieve any kind of full automation, even to imagine that that's possible. But I would say even if we did, it might be another 100 years before we really have the kind of advanced artificial intelligence that could do all of the things that people do.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Aaron. And still relates to the climate change and the migration. What do you think the effect of this global phenomenon to the future of work?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really scary, right? Because a lot of people like in Jakarta are living in coastal cities, that are very susceptible to rising sea levels. That's true not only there, but in New York and in many other great cities around the world. And so I think that it's a very scary thing to imagine a future of rising sea levels. And that's just one part of it, right? More extreme weather events, the die-off of insects and the loss of biodiversity. It's a very scary thing. And there are many very negative projections about what the future of work will look like under those conditions. And I'm very scared, I think, as your question indicated, of what will happen in a world with many climate refugees, where people are fleeing areas of the world that have become uninhabitable, trying to move, typically you imagine north to the more temperate climates. I think it's a very scary possibility. And I think it just shows you really how important it is that we try to change things now and that we put the world on a different track. And I think that that's only going to happen if we really de-emphasize profit and de-emphasize kind of like the private economy and try to get to a world that's sustainable, not only in an ecological sense, but also in a social sense, right? So I think that we have a lot of work ahead of us. We also have a lot of new tools and digital tools to connect with each other. We also, more and more people have education, they can read, they can, people live in cities. In spite of the pandemic, over the long term, people are healthier than they were in the past. And I really hope all of those changes, that increase in human development and possibility and connection, means that we can also connect with each other and organize together to really change the world towards a sustainable future, and then make for a much better future of work. I don't think it's a purely technology question. I think it's really a social and political question. And I just hope that people interacting with my work and generally thinking about this topic really come away with that sense that it's not just a story about technology and technological change and what people are doing in these private companies with technology. It's really a story about politics, about social questions, and that we can't leave them to these elites and business and technology to solve. We really have to play a much bigger role in changing things and deciding that future together.
Thank you very much, Aaron. It's very insightful presentation and discussion that how the future of works relates to the political and social being in many countries and geopolitical relations within our world. I wish you the best of luck in your future endeavors. We're very glad that you join us in this conference today. And on behalf of the committee of the event, I'd like to thank you for your participation to the audience on our first day of the conference. Thank you very much. Make sure you stay tuned again tomorrow for other amazing discussions about the future, starting at 10 a.m. Jakarta time. And for today, this discussion is available online at the YouTube in our YouTube Goethe-Institut and also CFDS UGM. So if you want to see your recording, Aaron, you can check out the link below or ask the committee. Thank you very much for today. I hope we can see each other in other platform.
Great. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. It's great.
Thank you. That's all
Have a
from
good
me.
night.
See you.
Bye.